Pangle, Professor of Government, and it's a very special pleasure to introduce an old friend from graduate school at the University of Chicago, Diana Schaub. Professor Schaub is a professor of political science at Loyola University of Maryland and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Her studies and teaching have focused on Montesquieu, American political thought and history, especially Lincoln and African American political thought, and the relevance of core American ideals to contemporary challenges and debates. She's the author of Erotic Liberalism, Women and Revolution in Montesquieu's Persian Letters, and Emancipating the Mind, Lincoln, the Founders, and Scientific Progress, as well as co-editor of What So Proudly We Hail, the American Story, the American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song. Today she's speaking to us on Lincoln's Lyceum address, Democratic Theory for Citizens. Please join me in welcoming Professor Schaub.
Okay. Great, thanks. I'm delighted to be here to reflect on what it means to be a constitutional people. And I am really lamenting modern progress because I don't have a angled podium, so sometimes I'll be holding it up, sometimes I'll be trying to use my books here. Let's see if we can make it through it. Since this is a Constitution Day address, let me start by drawing your attention to a specific right protected by the U.S. Constitution, the right of a people peaceably to assemble. Now, if you compare that right to the others protected by the First Amendment, right of religious worship, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right of petition, you'll notice something interesting. The right of assembly is the only one that includes an adverb, peaceably, which describes the proper disposition of those engaged in communal expressions of dissent. Peaceableness is a demanding standard, more demanding than nonviolence, since it applies to the attitude of those gathered, not just their actions. Yet, if being aggrieved and indeed outraged is the motive for coming together, then peaceability will be hard, requiring individual and collective self-restraint. The language of the Constitution indicates how fine the line is between an assembly of the people and a mob. Both in the summer of protests following the murder of George Floyd and in the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, we have witnessed assemblies of the people that did not remain peaceable. The most profound analysis of the dangers of mob rule was offered by Abraham Lincoln in 1838, during a time of national conflict that would, within a quarter century, eventuate in civil war. Only 28 years old, already in his second term in the Illinois House of Representatives, the young Whig politician was invited to deliver a lecture to the Springfield Young Men's Lyceum. The theme he chose was the perpetuation of our political institutions. Presenting a frightening sketch of democratic dysfunction, Lincoln traced a rise in incivility and discord tipping over into political violence. He showed how growing lawlessness, and worse, the toleration for lawlessness, eroded the people's trust in government. Looking into the future, he predicted that disgust with an ineffectual government would provide an opening for demagogic populists across the political spectrum. Individuals of unbounded ambition would seize upon the disaffection to undermine the constitutional order. From small beginnings in disrespect for law, the entire experiment in self-government would be overturned. Having described the disease, Lincoln prescribed the cure: fidelity to the Constitution and laws. Democratic citizenship, according to Lincoln, does not permit disobedience of any kind. Even unjust laws must be religiously obeyed until they are repealed or reformed through constitutional channels, which include not only election, but the broad avenues of persuasion, those First Amendment rights of speech, press, assembly, and petition. This is a cure that's easy to state, but difficult to instantiate. The course of antebellum events shows that Lincoln's speech did not bring his generation to worship at the altar of law-abidingness. If we listen more attentively, perhaps we can do better. With its warning against politically dangerous passions, the Lyceum address is timeless, speaking to our divided polity as much as to his own. While the basic lines of his argument are clear, The details of the speech are complex in their layering and challenging to many of our contemporary prejudices. Since we don't have time to delve into every aspect of the speech, my plan is to select just a few passages to examine more closely. So let's start with the title, The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. Perpetuation is not just Lincoln's subject, it's his aim. And as an aim, it might be thought to have a conservative character. The task of Lincoln's post-founding generation, at least as presented early in the speech, is limited to what seems to be the modest task of keeping intact, passing along to the next generation our grand and lucky inheritance as Americans. Yet at the same time, perpetuation breathes hope for the future. To perpetuate is to cause to endure indefinitely. In the last line of the speech, Lincoln compares our political institutions, which he desires to perpetuate, to the only greater institution, by which he means the church. So rock solid in its foundations that Lincoln says the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, actually, Lincoln didn't say that. That's a Bible verse. The Bible verse is Matthew 16:18, where Jesus founds his church on the disciple Peter's faith in the revealed Messiah. Could a political founding rival the founding of Christianity? Is there a form of government proof against death? Lincoln does say that as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. The question of whether free government can endure and what is required to make it endure preoccupied Lincoln from the start of his career. If the beginning is half of the whole, Lincoln's beginning promises much. In surveying the situation, he informs the Americans of 1838 that they are the legal inheritors of two fundamental blessings, basically the land and liberty. Lincoln foresees no difficulty in passing along this goodly land, unprofaned by the foot of an invader. However, serving as the caretaker of the political edifice is trickier, since the initial threat to it comes from an unavoidable source, time itself. Lincoln says our task is to transmit the political edifice undecayed by the lapse of time and untorn by usurpation. In other words, time itself is a threat, and an invidious one, an insidious one. As time elapses, we lapse. Almost imperceptibly, institutional decay, corruption set in. The second threat, usurpation, sounds violent. Although it's worth noting that the literal meaning of usurpation is, to take possession of by use. In other words, new usages and practices can distort and overtake the original modes. Just got to take a minute here. Is the mic on? Can you guys hear me mic'd, or do I need to project? Okay. So, to give you an example, the recent expansion of presidential power through the unopposed use of executive orders to do things that constitutionally should be done only by the legislative branch. So both of these dangers, both the chronic one of time and the acute one of usurpation, arise from within. They're forms of suicide, bringing about the self-destruction of self-government. So he's described this twin double threat, time and usurpation. Then Lincoln turns to the contemporary evidence of system-wide breakdown. He focuses on two particular instances of mob action. He calls them the most dangerous in example and revolting to humanity. He describes what happened in Mississippi, where a mob first targeted gamblers, then proceeded to lynch black men, then white men, supposed to be leagued with them, and finally, just random visitors from other states. He develops a lurid simile. Dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest. He then moves to a second horror-striking scene, which just so happens to be from another slave state, Missouri. Once again, Lincoln does all that he can to shock his audience into sympathy with the victim. A mulatto man by the name of McIntosh was seized in the street, dragged to the suburbs of the city, chained to a tree, and actually burned to death, all within a single hour from the time he'd been a free man, attending to his own business, at peace with the world. At this point, Lincoln interjects a question that he attributes to his audience. But you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? This is a favorite rhetorical technique of Lincoln's. Through his placement of questions, he creates a dialogic engagement with the audience. Sometimes, as here, he puts the words directly in the mouth of an objector, a naysayer. That allows the likely grounds of resistance to be expressed and for him to respond to them. Other times he will pose the questions himself as a way of advancing the argument, sort of signaling the new phases in the argument. Before this present question, he had already posed 5 others, and there are 7 more questions that follow this one. Significantly, however, this is the only one of the 13 questions to be ascribed to you, his listeners. But you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? I'm on sabbatical, so I'm out of the habit of talking. I do have gum with me. I may have to chew some. All right. So why does Lincoln anticipate pushback at this point? Today, we're all properly horrified by the nation's history of lynchings. But Lincoln was addressing an audience that might have felt some sympathy with the lynch mob, or if not sympathy with the actions of the mob, sympathy with its motives. So, what were those motives? Before we jump to, say, racism, we need to look more closely at the actual incidents. And remember, during these decades, from the 1830s to the Civil War, the majority of extrajudicial hangings were of whites. Lincoln's examples, however, are not of cattle rustlers or horse thieves, meeting rough frontier justice. In the Mississippi case, the initial target were the riverboat gamblers. Gambling had been recently legalized in the state, but many citizens, and maybe especially the most upstanding citizens, were morally opposed to gambling. They were angry at the perceived injustice of the gamblers. They were angry as well at the perceived injustice of the law that now allowed gambling. Anger is a potent sign of the thirst for justice, a thirst powerful enough to send human beings outside the law, especially when the law is slow or unreliable or simply wrong. Now, during this same time, public opinion was greatly aroused against the new type of abolitionist, the messianic abolitionists. They were intemperate in speech. They were intolerant of political compromise. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, was founded in 1831, followed by the establishment of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. They called for an immediate end to slavery and the annulment of the U.S. Constitution, They regarded the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. So, like the gamblers, the radical abolitionists were engaged in legal but extremely unpopular activity. This was the height of the abolitionist petition movement. It provoked the imposition of a gag rule in Congress and the ensuing controversy then over whether the gag rule violated the people's right to petition. Anti-abolitionist fervor extended well beyond the slave states. It was very strongly felt in Illinois. In 1837, the Illinois legislature joined other free states in passing resolutions condemning abolitionism. Significantly, Lincoln was one of only 6 of the 101 Illinois legislators to vote against those resolutions. He then took the further bold step of filing a protest against the Illinois anti-abolition resolutions. Now, in selecting his examples of mob rule, Lincoln quite deliberately avoids the incident that was uppermost in the minds of his Illinois audience. That incident was the murder of the abolitionist, Elijah Lovejoy, in 1837. Lovejoy had begun publishing an anti-slavery newspaper in Alton, Illinois, immediately after he had been thrown out of or driven out of St. Louis across the river, across the Mississippi River in the slave state of Missouri. So in November 1837, Lovejoy was shot and his printing press hurled into the river. Lincoln, in the Lyceum address, is speaking just a few weeks after that murder of the abolitionist. So he doesn't mention the incident. We might say he's avoiding triggering his audience. But his purpose, however, was not to cater to their sensibilities. Rather, by temporarily avoiding any mention of that specific incident, he's trying to induce them to lift their sights to the larger matters that are at stake, and in fact to help loosen the hold of their partisan passions so that they can begin to reason together. Lincoln knows how difficult it is to confront popular passions directly. Those in the grip of anger, or worse, anger compounded by fear, are disinclined to feel sympathy for others. They want sympathy for themselves. Aware of this resistance, Lincoln insists on giving it a voice. He's modeling civil discourse for them. So the you of his audience doesn't come right out and say what they want to say. They don't say, oh, what's the big deal? Those gambling thugs got what they deserved. Right? Instead, Lincoln has them say something defensive, but still responsive to the larger topic. They ask, oh, well, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? To prove that it has much to do with it, Lincoln first agrees in part with the objectors. He grants that the gamblers constitute a portion of population that is worse than useless. Worse than philosophers even, right? You know, philosophers are useless citizens. Well, gamblers, worse than useless. Lincoln goes so far as to imagine a pleasing scenario in which gamblers are annually swept from the stage of existence by a plague. Were nature to produce a morally discriminating virus, a sort of gambler-specific COVID, honest men would perhaps be much profited by the operation. So in the short space of a few paragraphs, Lincoln has flipped the perspective. We move from a description of the Mississippi hangings as revolting to humanity to the thought that, and this is a quote, these deaths are never matter of reasonable regret. The reversal of perspective is even more shocking when Lincoln proceeds to retell the story of McIntosh. Now we learn that he was not just minding his own business, he had committed a heinous murder. Since he must have died by the sentence of the law, for him, Lincoln says, it was as well the way it was. Gotta die, may as well die quickly. Lincoln vouches, in fact, that this is, quote, the correct reasoning in regard to the burning of the Negro in St. Louis. This sounds awfully hard-hearted. Lincoln first tried an all-out appeal to the sympathy, right, to generate sympathy for these victims. And then, anticipating the failure of that emotional appeal, he shifted to this very stark, callous reconsideration. Abstractly considered, he says the direct consequences of mob rule are of little consequence. The direct consequences, those particular deaths, of little consequence. Lincoln has intuited something very important about his audience. Any approach that focuses only on the direct effects of mob rule is bound to be unproductive, since the wider public, some small part of which is acting as a mob, basically welcomes the outcome. Gamblers and murderers quickly dispensed with. Lincoln disposes his audience to listen to him by validating their instinctive hostility to wrongdoers. Two things, however, should be noted. First, he renders their concern with justice less heatedly angry and more coolly calculative. And second, in the retelling of the events in Mississippi, he refers only to the gamblers at Vicksburg, saying nothing about the violence towards allegedly rebellious slaves and their supposed white allies. By leaving those more racially charged lynchings out of the retelling, he says nothing to belittle those deaths or to modify his initial horrifying portrait. So, to the extent that his own convictions allow, Lincoln has befriended the vigilantes and the defenders of the vigilantes. This enables him to draw their attention to consequences, indirect, prospective consequences that may have escaped their notice. Lincoln begins near the viewpoint of his audience. Rather than appealing altruistically to their concern for others, of which there's not very much, he instead appeals to their self-interest, but in a way that demonstrates the linkage between their self-interest and the cause of law-abidingness. So his first point then is that the mob might make mistakes and hang some of their own. Mobocrats themselves are not safe from mobocracy. From there, he widens the circle of concern to the truly innocent who might be falsely targeted by the mob. Without using, sort of boring legal language like due process, this section of the speech vindicates the slow, careful, methodical, procedural component of the justice system. Once the rule of law is trodden down, the consequences are far-reaching. Lincoln's next point is that the vigilantes have released something they did not anticipate. In their impatience, they skirted the law in pursuit of justice as they understood it. Since popular opinion was in sympathy with their conception of justice, the perpetrators went unpunished. That corruption breeds another corruption. When the lawless in spirit see that the law is not being enforced, they take that as an invitation to become lawless in practice. The vigilantes meant to crack down on crime. Lincoln tells them, you've emboldened the criminals. When law is disregarded for the sake of justice, that provides license who would disregard the law for the selfish purposes of their own. Lincoln doesn't indicate how many people fall into this category of the lawless in spirit, who are normally kept in check by the fear of punishment, but he is emphatic that there are those who regard government as their deadliest bane and who will make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations. Not only does mob justice always carry this danger, but even some forms of legitimate protest, like those involving mass direct action, can spiral out of control. Civil unrest is always an occasion for opportunistic looters and scammers, the lawless in spirit who become lawless in practice. Meanwhile, societal breakdown has a very different effect on good citizens. When government proves ineffectual in controlling riot and crime, the tranquility-loving people lose trust in it. According to Lincoln, the alienation of their affections from the government, that is the worst effect of the mobocratic spirit. Political scientists, public intellectuals have tracked rising levels of distrust, cynicism, apathy among Americans ever since the turmoil-filled 1960s and 70s, echoing, I think, Lincoln's conviction that the attachment of the people is the strongest bulwark of any government, and particularly of those constituted like ours. Democratic government really does depend on the disposition of the demos. According to Lincoln, the end point of this erosion of confidence will be regime change. The really dangerous opportunists are not the petty criminals, but the tyrannically inclined. Lincoln warns of men of sufficient talent and ambition who will seize the opportunity and strike the blow against free institutions. Sadly, they will be aided by the decent folks who in troubled times look to a strong man for deliverance. We, the people, become willing to trade anarchic liberty for despotic security, or at least the demagogic promise of it. Without being classically schooled, Lincoln seems to have discovered the disintegrative trajectory of extreme democracy that was first diagnosed by Plato and Aristotle. Only after tracing the long-term consequences of mob rule does Lincoln allude to the recent killing of the abolitionist editor Elijah Lovejoy. If his audience has been listening, they might now be inclined to react to current events with a little less knee-jerk fervor, whether that be pro-Lovejoy or anti-Lovejoy. Aware of the link between disregard for the law and the destruction of our political institutions, they will perhaps count themselves among those best citizens who can, because they foresee the danger, also act to avert the crisis. So, what then should they do? The answer, Lincoln says, is simple. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate, in the least particular, the laws of the country, and never to tolerate their violation by others. Lincoln's solution is absolute law-abidingness. And really more than that, the oath to obey should flow from an underlying attitude or state of feeling. Democratic citizens should obey not out of fear, but out of reverence. Indeed, Lincoln calls for reverence for the Constitution and laws to become the political religion of the nation. Although it is logic that has revealed the imperative of law-abidingness, Lincoln is aware that logic or reason alone will not secure the required obedience. Echoing, again, I think, Aristotle and the ancients, Lincoln highlights the role of habituation and piety in shaping a deferential attitude toward the law. Reverence depends on acculturation, hence the crucial role Lincoln assigns to teachers and preachers, and most especially mothers. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. It is the self-evident truths first set forth in the Declaration of Independence that establish the binding character of consent-based law. However, by appropriating religious language for political purposes, Lincoln seeks to endow that democratic theory with a sacred character. And so he says, again, let reverence for the laws become the political religion of the nation, and let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay, of all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. And yet, we might wonder whether there are not some exceptions to this first commandment of democratic life. According to Lincoln's list, the imperative applies to every American of whatever age, old or young, economic status, rich or poor, temperament, grave or gay, of whatever sex, whatever ethnic heritage, right, all sexes and tongues. And then he concludes with the two most interesting categories, those of all colors and conditions. Does the demand to revere the Constitution and laws apply to blacks in America in 1838? Surely they are within the orbit of all colors. Does it then apply to those black persons who found themselves in a condition of slavery, as well as to those in a condition of freedom? All colors and conditions. How could it? Doesn't the natural right to liberty of an enslaved person invalidate the man-made law that establishes property in man? Aren't slaves within their right to attempt escape? Aren't they even within their rights to murder their masters in their beds? Despite being counted in the census as 3/5 of a free person for the purpose of determining the number of a state's representatives, the slave population existed outside the bounds of consent. We know that slave masters taught a quietistic version of Christianity to their human chattels, emphasizing the biblical injunction, "Slaves, obey your masters." However, an American political religion, sworn upon the blood of the Revolution, could never demand or justify the obedience of enslaved persons. Thomas Jefferson was utterly frank on this point. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he pointed out that although slaves constituted 1/2 the citizens of his state, they could not be expected to have any patriotic sentiment. Moreover, should they exercise their natural right of revolution, God would be on their side, the slave's side. The slaveholder Jefferson declared that the Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us, the slaveholders, in such a contest. All that Lincoln ever wrote about the Declaration of Independence indicates that he subscribed to this idea of pre-political natural rights and its by any means necessary ethos. So his call for a political religion of law-abidingness must have application to free citizens only. In effect, slaves remain in a state of war vis-a-vis their oppressors. But even this exemption for the tyrannized doesn't resolve all the difficulties in combining respect for law with a creed that enshrines revolutionary resistance to violations of rights. What, for instance, is the obligation of the friends of the slaves among the citizens? How much must they sacrifice upon the altar of the law? Lincoln acknowledges the problem. Law at its best seeks justice, but it's never identical to justice. Moreover, sometimes law is used to establish and maintain injustice. What then? Here's what Lincoln says. When I so pressingly urge a strict observance of all the laws, let me not be understood as saying there are no bad laws. I mean no such thing. Lincoln had more experience than we have of bad laws. Not only was slavery legal in half the states of the Union, but the entire nation was under a constitutional obligation to return fugitive slaves to bondage. In an 1855 letter to his friend, Joshua Speed, his slaveholding friend, Lincoln describes the terrible sight of slaves being, quote, hunted down and caught, carried back to their stripes and unrewarded toils. But, he says, I bite my lip and keep quiet. He warns Speed that Southerners should not be oblivious to the moral and emotional toll exacted by this duty. You ought rather to appreciate how much the great body of the Northern people do crucify their feelings in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union. Comparing obedience to the Fugitive Slave Clause to a crucifixion, Lincoln stresses the agony of compliance. The slaves are not the only sufferers. All individuals of conscience suffered under the slave system. In this one regard, at least, the Constitution required the sacrifice of one's moral and humane sentiments. Lincoln is delivering a hard lesson in democratic theory. For citizens, there is no option of, quote, civil disobedience. All disobedience is uncivil and destructive of civil government. There is, of course, a right of revolution, but short of that exigency, there is only acknowledgement of the majority's legitimate power through their ballots to determine the motion of the body politic. It's not that the majority is always right, it frequently is not, but the majority does have rightful authority, an authority that is itself grounded in the truth of natural equality and its logical corollary, government by consent. Offering a glimmer of hope and change, Lincoln points out that there is a democratic mechanism for addressing the problem of bad laws. Quote, "Bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible." Yet he immediately repeats the desideratum. Still, while they continue in force for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed. I just want you to think about that for a little bit. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., influenced in part by the antinomianism of Henry David Thoreau and Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, 1849, Thoreau's essay, King famously argued that one can show respect for law and speed the repeal of bad law by means of a specific mode of lawbreaking. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, King declares, "One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law." Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. are often viewed as our nation's greatest moral lights. Yet they fundamentally disagree on this foundational question about the nature of citizenship and the relationship between law and justice. I think there's probably no better exercise for every American than to read Lincoln's Lyceum and King's letter side by side, making a good faith effort to suspend one's biases. And I suspect that for most of you, your biases are on the side of King. But if you would undertake this, try to undertake it in a way that really tests the logic of the two positions. For Lincoln, the choice is limited to the ballot or the bullet, where ballot is a kind of shorthand, not just for the elective franchise, but for the myriad tools of democratic persuasion: free speech, free press, right of assembly, right of petition, access to the courts. Including, by the way, the very powerful tactic implicit within judicial review of testing local, state, and federal laws against the Constitution. It's important to remember this. There is, in a way, a kind of constitutionalized version of civil, quote, civil disobedience. Remember, Rosa Parks broke no law. Right? That was a way of testing the constitutionality of those segregation laws. The court found in her favor that law was null and void because it was in contradiction to the Constitution itself. But outright nullification, right, no matter how nonviolent, is impermissible, whether by Thoreau's minority of one or John C. Calhoun's minority of South Carolina, which had proclaimed a, quote, right of state interposition against federal laws that it regarded as unjust and discriminatory. While I think there is much, very much, to celebrate in King's legacy, it still seems to me an open question whether his advocacy of civil disobedience has not, as Lincoln would have predicted, eroded respect for the rule of law. Could the 20th century struggle for civil rights have been conducted exclusively through constitutionally prescribed means? In considering this, I think it is extraordinarily important to remember that no law breaking at all was involved in most of the techniques and most of the activities of the movement. The ingenious battle in the courts that was waged by the NAACP, the dangerous work of voter registration in the South, the Montgomery bus boycott, similar heroic instances of nonviolent mass protest, all were fully within the law. At the least, one might say that the popularity of King's Birmingham Jail essay, which I think most students read at some point in their schooling, has maybe inflated the role that disobedience played in bringing about positive social change, both in King's endeavors and certainly in the larger civil rights struggle. One might also consider whether King's strictures on the allowable mode of lawbreaking, open, loving, accepting the penalty, whether that would have worked in Lincoln's day with respect to the fugitive slave law. The law was resisted, but the Underground Railroad operated by necessity in secret, not openly. The aim, of course, was not really the repeal of the law. It was simply rescue and spiriting to freedom of as many slaves as possible. Frederick Douglass, who was involved in those activities, wrote a really interesting editorial, 1854, entitled, "Is It Right and Wise to Kill a Kidnapper?" in which he called for a more open, dramatic, and violent form of resistance, arguing that the slave hunting bloodhounds, and that included federal marshals or people who had been deputized by federal marshals, that they had forfeited their right to life by their assault on those who were pursuing their own right to liberty, and further, that since the government was failing in its duty to protect the innocent, either the slave or his friends might act in his defense, meting out bloody death to those engaged in the infernal business. By the way, similar arguments were occasionally heard in response to the original Roe v. Wade decision in justification of the targeting of abolitionists. Abortionists. Now, Douglass's endorsement of violence, I think, should also be a voice in this discussion. Douglass's argument is a kind of precursor of Malcolm X's assertion that, quote, when our people are being bitten by dogs, they are within their rights to kill those dogs. And in that statement, dogs is a kind of code word for the policemen who were at the other end of the leash holding those attacking dogs. In other words, Malcolm X understood the Lockean logic. Legitimate government based on a free ballot binds the individual to obedience. Illegitimate government does not. The Lockean corrective to governmental abuse is revolution, or at least the potent threat of revolution. As Malcolm X put it, it'll be Molotov cocktails this month, hand grenades next month, and something else next month. It'll be ballots or it'll be bullets. It'll be liberty or it will be death. His incendiary language notwithstanding, he was careful to present this violence in the context of justifiable self-defense. I don't mean to go out and get violent, but at the same time, you should never be nonviolent unless you run into some nonviolence. It's often said that Malcolm X was useful to the cause of racial justice because his extremism frightened white Americans into accepting reforms they otherwise wouldn't have. In other words, Malcolm played bad cop to Martin's good cop. But instead of that blithe historicist justification, perhaps we should consider the possibility that elements of Malcolm X's radicalism were in fact superior on their own terms because they held true to the nation's foundations and were in the long run less dangerous. Malcolm X is simply not antinomian in the way that King is. And as Lincoln argues in the Lyceum address, antinomianism, which acknowledges no authority other than the individual conscience, threatens not just law and order, but more profoundly, law and justice. While one might disagree with Malcolm X's assertion that blacks in America were nothing more than victims of Americanism, his classic formulation of the issue, the ballot or the bullet, accords with the understanding of John Locke, the American founders, and Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, Lincoln uses that same formulation in the special message to Congress, talks about it in terms of ballots and bullets. All right, so let's sort of wrap this up here. After Lincoln gives his diagnosis of the present danger and prescribes the cure, one might expect that he would bring his speech to a conclusion. However, instead of wrapping things up, Lincoln poses another question, one that suggests his audience might be overly complacent about the future. Lincoln's planted naysayer now asks, why suppose danger to our political institutions? Have we not preserved them for more than 50 years? In response, Lincoln undertakes a fascinating reconsideration of the founding generation. Back in the very beginning of the speech, Lincoln had spoken of a hardy, brave, and patriotic race of ancestors. Now, however, Lincoln reveals that the ancestors were composed of two distinct human types, the few and the many, that ancient staple of political reflection, the few and the many, motivated by different but equally questionable passions. On Lincoln's retelling, the success of the national experiment can be traced to some less than admirable traits. In 1776, the few were avid for celebrity and fame and distinction, while the many were driven by deep-rooted principles of hate and the powerful motive of revenge directed against the British. Thus, the self-serving passions of both the few and the many were happily, or coincidentally, mustered in the service of the cause of civil and religious liberty. So he subjects the passions of both the few and the many to this withering assessment. He then argues that these passions, which remain in play, will not have the same good effect in the future, in the post-founding generations. What avenue would be available to individuals with founding-type aspirations? Lincoln insists that an Alexander, a Caesar, a Napoleon simply does not fit within the horizon of a republic. Such figures, should they arise, and Lincoln is certain that they will, they would be republic destroyers. Further, Lincoln fears that the most base passions of ordinary folks, passions like envy and avarice and hatred, will in future be directed inward, right, against one's fellow Americans. His conclusion is emphatic. Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Now, like the demand for reverential obedience, this anti-passion message, I think, is hard for us to hear. I mean, every graduation speech that you go to, every self-help manual that you read tells you, find your passion, live your passion. But the celebration of passion has a downside, especially for our politics. A passionate and impassioning politics is likely to be divisive, marked by hyperpartisanship, hate-filled invective, insufferable self-righteousness, and general nastiness. From the Lyceum address to the second inaugural, Lincoln rejects attempts to impassion political life. He avoids making visceral appeals to hatred and revenge. So, for instance, he'll speak against slavery, but not against slaveholders. He's skittish even about appeals to compassion. To be compassionate is to suffer along with the sufferer, but that quite naturally provokes anger at those who cause the suffering. While Lincoln certainly composed quite moving passages about the wrongfulness of slavery, in general, he did not dwell on or try to evoke the horrors of the institution in the way, say, that the abolitionist orators did. Lincoln sought always to lift the slavery debate to the level of principle and unimpassioned reason, avoiding the dangerous ground of compassion, anger, and blame. The Lyceum address began by describing the task of the current generation as maintaining the political edifice of liberty and equal rights. Toward the end of the speech, Lincoln indicates that the props that once supported that edifice now are decayed, crumbled away. Those old props were the passions of the few and the many during the Revolutionary period. Lincoln forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. If the founders attempt to prove the capability of a people to govern themselves, if that depended on props, then has the proposition really been proved? Lincoln implies that until reason presides over passion in the souls of Americans, the proposition remains unproven. The post-founding generations have a great unfinished task before them, a task that rivals and perhaps surpasses the task of founding. Each subsequent generation of Americans must give its own practical demonstration of the possibility of self-government. It might be worth remembering, this is the final paragraph here, it might be worth remembering that the party to which the young Lincoln belonged, the Whigs, favored what they called internal improvements. And by that they meant, build canals, build roads, improve the infrastructure of the existing United States. In the Lyceum address, Lincoln calls for a spiritualized and more demanding version of internal improvements. His focus is on the quality of the American soul, the American character. Self-government in the collective depends on the existence of self-governing individuals. Hence Lincoln's call for general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws. It turns out that there is no perpetuation without betterment, and there's no better guide to that betterment than Abraham Lincoln. Thanks.